When William Carr opened that innocent-looking package on Father's Day morning, he never imagined his own daughter had sent him a hissing nightmare that would shatter his family forever. What started as a gift became the final straw in a toxic relationship built on manipulation, greed, and betrayal. Stay with me until the end of this incredible true story and comment below what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels around the world. The morning sun filtered through our kitchen blinds as I sat at the breakfast table, still in my pajamas, savoring what I thought would be a peaceful Father's Day. At 68, I'd learned to appreciate the quiet moments, the steam rising from my coffee cup, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the soft padding of Jessica's slippers as she moved around our kitchen preparing what had become our Sunday tradition blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup. "Happy Father's Day, sweetheart," Jessica said, leaning over to kiss the top of my graying head. After 43 years of marriage, she still had that way of making me feel like the luckiest man alive. Her silver hair caught the morning light, and despite the worry lines that had deepened around her eyes over the past few years, worry lines that I knew were largely my fault, or rather my daughter's fault, she was still the most beautiful woman I'd ever known. "Thank you, Jess," I murmured, catching her hand and squeezing it gently. "Though honestly, just having a quiet morning with you is gift enough." She smiled, but I caught that flicker of something in her eyes. The same look she'd been wearing for months now, whenever we talked about family, about holidays, about anything that might involve our daughter Samantha. It was a look that said she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the peace to be shattered by another crisis, another demand, another manipulation. I was about to tell her not to worry, that maybe this time would be different when the doorbell rang. Jessica froze her spatula suspended over the pancake batter. We looked at each other across the kitchen, and I could see my own thoughts reflected in her face. Who could that be? It's barely 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning. "I'll get it," I said, pushing back from the table. My knees creaked as I stood, a reminder that I wasn't the young man I used to be, though I still felt strong enough to handle whatever life threw at me. Or so I thought. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time, followed by 3 sharp knocks. Whoever was out there was in a hurry. "William," Jessica called softly from the kitchen. "Maybe we should just ignore it." But I was already walking toward the front door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors we'd refinished just 2 years ago. Through the frosted glass of our front door, I could make out the shape of someone in a brown uniform, a delivery person. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door to find a young woman with a clipboard and a large cardboard box at her feet. She looked harried, checking her watch and then glancing back at her truck parked in our driveway. "William Carr?" she asked, not quite meeting my eyes. "That's me. I have a delivery for you. Special delivery. I need you to sign here." She thrust the clipboard toward me, tapping an X marked next to a signature line. I glanced down at the box. It was about the size of a shoebox, but longer, maybe 18 inches by 12 inches by 8 inches deep. Plain brown cardboard, nothing fancy, but there was something odd about it. Along the sides, I could see tiny holes punched through the cardboard. Breathing holes. "What's in it?" I asked, suddenly wary. The delivery woman shrugged. "No idea. I just deliver them. But I need to tell you, this one's been making some weird noises. Might want to be careful when you open it." She said this casually, as if delivering potentially dangerous packages was just part of her everyday routine. I signed the clipboard with a growing sense of unease. "Who sent it?" She consulted her paperwork. "Says here it's from S. Morrison. That mean anything to you?" My blood ran cold. Morrison was Samantha's married name. My daughter had sent this box with its mysterious contents and its breathing holes to arrive on Father's Day morning. "Yeah," I said quietly, "I know who that is." The delivery woman handed me my copy of the receipt and hurried back to her truck, leaving me standing in the doorway holding the paperwork and staring down at the box. Now that I was looking more closely, I could see that some of the breathing holes had been punched from the inside out. Whatever was in there had been trying to get out. "William?" Jessica appeared beside me, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What is it?" "Who was—" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the box. Her face went white. "It's from Samantha," I said. Jessica took a step back, pressing the dish towel to her mouth. Oh God, William, don't open it. Can't you see? Look at those holes. Look at the way. She trailed off, staring at the box with undisguised horror. That's when I heard it. A soft scraping sound like something moving against cardboard, then unmistakably a hiss. Jesus Christ! I breathed, nearly dropping the box. I held it away from my body, my hands trembling slightly. The thing inside moved again, and I could feel the weight shift from one end to the other. Call the police, Jessica whispered. William, call the police right now. Jess, maybe it's just... Call them? Her voice was sharp with panic. Our daughter just sent us a box with something alive inside it, something that hisses. On Father's Day. Call the goddamn police. I'd never heard Jessica use that kind of language. In 4 decades of marriage, through job losses and health scares and family drama, I could count on one hand the number of times I'd heard her swear. The fact that she was cursing now told me everything I needed to know about how serious this situation was. I carried the box carefully into the living room and set it on the coffee table as far from the couch as possible. The hissing sound came again, longer this time, and definitely angry. Jessica disappeared into the kitchen and returned with our cordless phone, her fingers already dialing 911. Yes, this is Jessica Carr at 1247 Maple Avenue, she said into the phone, her voice steadier than I'd expected. We need police and animal control. Someone has sent us a package with what appears to be a live snake inside. She paused, listening. No, we haven't opened it. Yes, we're keeping our distance. Please, hurry. She hung up, and we both stood there staring at the box on our coffee table, like it might explode at any moment. The thing inside had gone quiet, but somehow that was worse than the hissing. At least when it was making noise, we knew where it was. Why? Jessica asked finally. Why would she do this? I didn't have an answer, or rather I had too many answers, none of them good. Samantha hadn't always been like this. There was a time when she was Daddy's little girl, when she'd run to greet me at the door after work with arms wide and a smile that could light up the whole house. She'd been a bright kid, curious and funny with Jessica's quick wit and my stubborn determination. We'd had such hopes for her. But somewhere along the way, things went wrong. Maybe it was the divorce from her first husband when she was 28, or the series of bad relationships that followed. Maybe it was the gambling problem she'd developed in her 30s, or the way she'd learned to manipulate people to get what she wanted. Maybe it was just the simple, awful fact that some people are broken in ways that can't be fixed no matter how much you love them or how hard you try. For the past 5 years, Samantha and her current husband, Peter, had been bleeding us dry. It started small, $100 here, $200 there, always for some emergency that couldn't wait. Peter had lost his job, they said. The car had broken down. The kids needed school supplies. The rent was due and they were short. We helped because that's what parents do. You help your children even when they're adults, even when they should know better. You help because you love them and because you remember the little girl who used to fall asleep in your arms while you read her bedtime stories. But the requests got bigger and more frequent. $1,000 for Peter's gambling debts, $3,000 for Samantha's credit card bills, $5,000 to prevent foreclosure on their house, a house they'd bought with money they didn't have for a lifestyle they couldn't afford. We refinanced our own home twice to help them. I delayed my retirement by 3 years to keep the money flowing. Jessica went back to work at 62, taking a part-time job at the local library that she didn't need and didn't want, just so we could afford to keep supporting our daughter's increasingly expensive mistakes. And through it all, Samantha never said thank you, never acknowledged the sacrifices we were making, never seemed to understand that every dollar we gave them was a dollar we couldn't spend on ourselves, on our own retirement, on our own dreams. Instead, she treated our help as an entitlement. When we couldn't give her as much as she wanted, or when we asked her to be more responsible with the money, she'd get angry. She'd accuse us of not caring about her or her children. She'd threaten to cut us out of their lives, to move away where we'd never see our grandchildren again. The grandchildren. That was always her trump card, and she knew it. Tommy was 12 now, a sweet kid who loved baseball and video games and still hugged his grandpa like he meant it. Sarah was 9, artistic and sensitive with Jessica's gentle nature and a smile that could melt your heart. They were innocent in all of this casualties of their parents' dysfunction, and Samantha knew we'd do anything to stay in their lives. 2 months ago, Jessica and I had finally reached our breaking point. After a particularly ugly confrontation where Samantha had screamed at us for refusing to pay for a vacation they couldn't afford, a vacation to Disney World that would have cost us $6,000, we'd made the hardest decision of our lives. We cut them off. No more emergency loans, no more credit card payments, no more bailouts for poor decisions and irresponsible behavior. We changed the locks on our house after Samantha had shown up drunk one night, pounding on our door and demanding money. We changed our phone number after she'd started calling at all hours. Sometimes hanging up without speaking, sometimes leaving voicemails full of vitriol and blame. It had been 2 months of blessed silence, 2 months of sleeping through the night without wondering when the next crisis call would come. 2 months of actually enjoying our retirement, of taking walks together and reading books and remembering why we'd fallen in love in the first place. And now this. A box with breathing holes and something inside that hissed like a rattlesnake. "The police are coming," Jessica said, settling onto the arm of our recliner but keeping her eyes fixed on the coffee table. "They said they'd have animal control with them." I nodded, unable to take my eyes off the box. "How long did they say?" 10 minutes, maybe 50. We waited in tense silence, both of us afraid to move or speak too loudly, as if the thing in the box might somehow escape if we disturbed it. Every few minutes, we'd hear a soft scraping sound or another hiss, and Jessica would flinch like she'd been slapped. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 12 minutes, we heard sirens in the distance growing closer. Then car doors slamming in our driveway, footsteps on our front porch, and a firm knock at the door. "Police!" a voice called out. "Mr. and Mrs. Carr." I opened the door to find 2 uniformed officers and a woman in khaki pants and a polo shirt with animal control embroidered on the chest. One of the officers was young, maybe late 20s, with close-cropped hair and alert eyes. The other was older, graying around the temples, with the kind of calm demeanor that comes from years of dealing with domestic disputes and family drama. "I'm Officer Martinez," the younger one said, "and this is Officer Thompson. This is Sarah Chen from Animal Control. We understand you've received a package with a possible live animal inside." "That's right," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "It's on the coffee table in the living room. My daughter sent it." The officers exchanged a look that I couldn't quite interpret. Officer Thompson, the older one, pulled out a small notebook and pen. "Your daughter sent you a live animal?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "We think so. The box has breathing holes, and we can hear hissing sounds coming from inside." Sarah Chen, the animal control officer, was already moving toward the coffee table, pulling on thick gloves as she walked. She had a large canvas bag with her, along with what looked like a long stick with a hook on the end. "Has anyone opened the box?" she asked, without looking back at us. "No," Jessica said quickly. "We called as soon as we realized what it might be." Sarah knelt next to the coffee table and examined the box carefully. She pointed out the breathing holes to the officers, then held her ear close to the cardboard. Almost immediately, the thing inside responded with a long, angry hiss that made all of us take a step back. "Definitely a snake," Sarah said, sitting back on her heels. "From the sound of it, probably a small constrictor. Ball python, maybe, or a corn snake. Nothing immediately dangerous, but still, not something you want loose in your house." Officer Thompson was still scribbling in his notebook. "Mr. Carr, can you tell us about your relationship with your daughter? Has there been any recent conflict or disagreement?" I felt my face flush with embarrassment. "How do you explain to a stranger that your own child has been terrorizing you, that the little girl you raised and loved and sacrificed for has turned into someone you barely recognize?" We had to cut off financial support recently," I said finally. "Samantha and her husband have been having money problems for years, and we've been helping them. But it got to the point where it was affecting our own financial security, so we had to draw the line." "When was this?" Officer Martinez asked. "About 2 months ago. We haven't heard from them since then." "Until today." Jessica moved closer to me, and I could feel her trembling slightly. "She's been angry with us," she added quietly. "Very angry." Sarah Chen had opened her canvas bag and was pulling out what looked like a large plastic container with air holes. "I'm going to open the box now," she announced. "Everyone please step back to the far side of the room." We retreated to the kitchen doorway while Sarah carefully cut the tape holding the box closed. She lifted one flap, then another, using her hooked stick to hold the cardboard away from her body. Then she peered inside and let out a soft whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," she muttered. "It's a ball python, all right. About 3 feet long, looks healthy. And there's a note." Officer Thompson stepped forward. "What kind of note?" Sarah used her stick to lift out a folded piece of paper. "Just says, 'Happy Father's Day, Dad. I hope you enjoy your gift as much as you've enjoyed destroying our lives.'" The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt Jessica's hand on my arm steadying me, but the room seemed to tilt sideways for a moment. My daughter, my little girl, had sent me a snake. An actual living snake. On Father's Day. "There's more," Sarah continued, still reading. "It says, 'This snake is exactly what you are. Cold-blooded and heartless. Maybe now you'll understand how it feels to be afraid in your own home.'" Officer Martinez was writing furiously in his notebook. "Mr. Carr, I have to ask, is there any history of violence or threats from your daughter or her husband?" I thought about Peter's drunken phone calls, the way he'd shoved me when they'd come to demand money after we'd cut them off, Samantha's screaming fits when she didn't get her way. "Some verbal threats," I said carefully. "Nothing physical until recently." "Recently," Jessica spoke up. "2 weeks ago, they came to the house demanding money. When William refused, Peter pushed him. That's when we changed the locks." Both officers were paying close attention now. This wasn't just a prank gone wrong or a family misunderstanding. This was escalating harassment, and they knew it. "We're going to need to file a report," Officer Thompson said. "This constitutes threatening behavior, and depending on your local laws, sending a live animal through the mail could be considered animal cruelty as well. Do you want to press charges?" I looked at Jessica, seeing my own anguish reflected in her eyes. "Press charges against our own daughter. Have her arrested for sending us a snake. 6 months ago, I would have said it was impossible. Today, standing in my living room while a professional removed a python from a box my child had mailed to me, it felt inevitable." "Yes," I said quietly. "Yes, we want to press charges." Sarah had successfully transferred the snake to her container and was securing the lid. "This little guy seems healthy enough," she said. "He's probably been stressed by the whole experience, but he should be fine. We'll take him to the shelter and see if we can find him a proper home." She paused, looking at the 4 of us gathered in my living room on what was supposed to have been a peaceful Father's Day morning. "I have to ask, who does something like this? I mean, I've seen people abandon animals, neglect them, even abuse them, but mailing a snake to your father? That's a new one for me." I didn't have an answer for her. I'd been asking myself the same question for years: who had my daughter become? When did the sweet child who used to make me Father's Day cards out of construction paper and glitter turn into someone capable of this kind of cruelty? After the police and animal control left, Jessica and I sat in our kitchen, the remains of our Father's Day breakfast still scattered across the counter. The pancake batter had gone flat, the coffee was cold, and the peaceful morning we'd planned felt like something from another lifetime. "We have to get a restraining order," Jessica said finally. She was holding her coffee mug with both hands, but I could see that she was still shaking slightly. "I know. And we have to tell the kids. Tommy and Sarah. They need to understand what's happening." That was the part that broke my heart the most. How do you explain to a 12-year-old boy that his mother is so angry with his grandparents that she's sending them dangerous animals in the mail? How do you tell a 9-year-old girl that the adults in her life are so broken that the police had to get involved? "We'll figure it out," I said, though I had no idea how. Jessica reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm scared, William. I'm scared of what she might do next. If she's capable of this." She gestured toward the living room where the coffee table still bore the imprint of the box that had contained our daughter's twisted gift. "I know. I'm scared too." And I was. For 40 years, I'd been Samantha's father. I'd taught her to ride a bike and helped her with homework and walked her down the aisle at her first wedding. I'd held her when she cried and celebrated her successes and worried about her failures. But somewhere in the last few years, the relationship had become something else entirely. I wasn't her father anymore. I was her enemy. The phone rang, making both of us jump. Jessica looked at me with wide eyes. "Don't answer it," she said. But I was already reaching for the cordless phone we'd left on the counter. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but somehow I knew who it was anyway. Hello. Did you get your present, old man? The voice was Peter's, my son-in-law, and he was clearly drunk. Or high. Or both. The police just left, I said calmly, though my heart was racing. They have the snake and they have the note. We're pressing charges. Peter laughed a harsh sound that made my skin crawl. Press all the charges you want. You think we're scared of you? You think we give a shit about your precious police reports? Jessica was gesturing frantically for me to hang up, but I couldn't. It was like watching a car accident, horrible but impossible to look away. This is just the beginning. Peter continued his words slightly slurred, but his meaning crystal clear. You want to cut us off? You want to pretend like we don't exist? Fine. But don't think you're going to do it without consequences. We know where you live, remember? We know your routines. We know when you go to bed and when you wake up and where you buy your groceries. Are you threatening us? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm promising you, you and that bitch wife of yours are going to pay for what you've done to us, to our kids. You think you're such good grandparents? Wait until Tommy and Sarah find out what kind of people you really are. Wait until they understand that Grandma and Grandpa threw their family out on the street. The line went dead. I set the phone down with shaking hands and looked at Jessica, who had gone pale again. That was Peter. I struggled to find the words. He's not done. This isn't over. Jessica closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, there was something new there. Not just fear, but determination. Then we'll be ready, she said quietly. We'll get the restraining order, we'll install security cameras, we'll do whatever we have to do. But we're not going to let them destroy us, William. We're not going to let 43 years of marriage and love and building a life together be ruined by their hate. I reached for her hand and held it tight. Outside, the sun was still shining, and somewhere in the neighborhood, other families were probably enjoying their Father's Day celebrations, barbecues and gifts and laughter, and all the normal things that normal families do on normal Sundays. But we weren't a normal family anymore. We were people who had to call the police because our own daughter sent us a snake. We were grandparents who might never see our grandchildren again because their parents had chosen revenge over reconciliation. We were the victims of our own child's cruelty, and that Father's Day morning sitting in our kitchen with cold coffee and the lingering smell of fear in the air, we finally understood that there would be no going back to the way things used to be. The box was gone, but the serpent it had contained was nothing compared to the one that had been growing in our family for years. A serpent made of resentment and entitlement and the kind of toxic anger that poisons everything it touches. As I sat there holding Jessica's hand and trying to process what had just happened to our lives, I realized that in sending us that snake, Samantha had revealed something far more dangerous than a 3-foot python. She had shown us exactly who she had become, and for the first time in 37 years of being her father, I understood that the daughter I had raised and loved was truly, completely gone. The days following that horrific Father's Day blurred together in a haze of legal consultations, police reports, and sleepless nights. Jessica and I found ourselves jumping at every unexpected sound. The mail truck rumbling down our street, a branch scraping against the window, even the familiar creak of our old house settling at night. What had once been our sanctuary now felt like a fortress under siege. Attorney Margaret Summers had an office downtown in one of those renovated Victorian houses that lawyers seemed to love, all dark wood paneling and leather-bound books that probably hadn't been opened in decades. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with steel gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and the kind of direct gaze that told you she'd seen it all before. Mr. and Mrs. Carr, she said, gesturing for us to take seats in the heavy chairs across from her mahogany desk. I've reviewed the police report, and I have to tell you, this is one of the more unusual cases I've handled. Not because family disputes aren't common, but because the escalation pattern here is quite concerning. Jessica reached for my hand as Margaret opened a thick file folder. I could see copies of our statements, photographs of the box, even what looked like a picture of the snake itself coiled in Sarah Chen's plastic container. The restraining order is straightforward, Margaret continued. Given the threatening phone call and the nature of the gift, Judge Harrison will almost certainly approve it. Your daughter and son-in-law will be legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of your home, your workplace, or any location where you regularly spend time. What about the grandchildren? Jessica asked quietly. It was the question that had been eating at both of us since that morning 3 days ago. Margaret's expression softened slightly. That's more complicated. Tommy and Sarah haven't done anything wrong, obviously, but if they're living with Samantha and Peter and those two are prohibited from contacting you, she spread her hands in a gesture that said what we already knew. We might not see our grandchildren again. The weight of that possibility settled over me like a heavy blanket. Tommy, with his gap-toothed grin and his obsession with baseball statistics. Sarah, who still believed in fairies and drew pictures of flowers that she'd solemnly present to Jessica with the gravity of someone offering the crown jewels. They were innocent casualties in a war they didn't even understand. There is something else we need to discuss, Margaret said, her tone becoming more businesslike. Have you given any thought to updating your will and estate planning documents? I felt Jessica stiffen beside me. What do you mean? Well, currently I assume your daughter is listed as a beneficiary. Given the circumstances, you might want to consider making some changes. Not just for obvious reasons, but because inheritance disputes can get very ugly, especially when there's already this level of animosity. The thought hadn't even occurred to me, but now it seemed glaringly obvious. Of course, Samantha was in our will. She was our only child. But the idea of her inheriting our life savings, our home, everything we'd worked for, especially after what she'd just put us through, made my stomach turn. What would you recommend? I asked. Several options. You could disinherit her entirely, which sends a clear message, but might create additional legal challenges down the road. Or you could set up a trust for the grandchildren's education, something she couldn't touch but that would still benefit the family. There are tax advantages to consider as well. As we drove home from Margaret's office, Jessica was quiet for a long time, staring out the passenger window at the familiar neighborhoods we'd called home for over 20 years. Finally, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. I keep thinking about when she was little, she said. Remember when she was 7 and she saved up all her allowance money to buy me that ugly ceramic cat for Mother's Day? She was so proud, so excited to give it to me. Where did that little girl go, William? When did she turn into someone who could terrorize her own parents? I didn't have an answer because I'd been asking myself the same question for years. The Samantha who had sent us that snake was a stranger wearing our daughter's face. But somewhere buried deep inside that stranger was the child who had once crawled into our bed during thunderstorms, who had insisted on helping me change the oil in the car, even though she usually just got in the way, who had cried when she accidentally stepped on a caterpillar in the garden. When we got home, there was a police car parked across the street. Officer Martinez got out and walked over to us as we pulled into our driveway. Mr. and Mrs. Carr, he said, I wanted to let you know that we attempted to serve the restraining order papers this morning. Your daughter and son-in-law weren't at their listed address. According to the neighbors, they moved out sometime in the last couple of days. No forwarding address. My heart sank. What does that mean? It means we'll keep trying to serve them, but it complicates things. We've put out a bolo, be on the lookout, with their vehicle information and descriptions. If they show up into this neighborhood or try to contact you, call us immediately. After Officer Martinez left, Jessica and I sat in our living room, the same room where we'd watched animal control remove a python from our coffee table just 3 days earlier. The afternoon light was slanting through the windows, creating patterns on the carpet, but instead of feeling peaceful, the house felt empty and vulnerable. They're out there somewhere, Jessica said, planning God knows what. I was about to respond when the phone rang. Both of us froze. It had been ringing more frequently over the past few days, reporters who had somehow gotten wind of the story. Curious neighbors, even a few crank calls from people who thought the whole thing was hilarious. Jessica had started letting the answering machine pick up, but this time she reached for it before I could stop her. Hello. Her voice was cautious. I watched her face change, saw her grip tighten on the receiver. She looked at me with wide, frightened eyes and mouthed a single word, Tommy. My grandson's voice was small and scared when she put the phone on speaker. Grandma, are you there? I'm here, sweetheart. Grandpa's here too. Are you okay? His voice cracked. and I could tell he was crying. Mom and Dad are really mad. They keep yelling about you and Grandpa, and they packed up all our stuff and we had to leave our house. Sarah's been crying all day and I don't understand what's happening. My heart was breaking listening to him. This 12-year-old boy was caught in the middle of his parents' vendetta against us, and there wasn't a damn thing we could do to protect him. "Where are you now, honey?" Jessica asked gently. "I don't know. Some motel. It smells funny and the TV doesn't work right. Mom said we can't go back to school until she figures some things out." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Grandma, did you really call the police on Mom?" Jessica closed her eyes and I could see the pain written across her face. How do you explain to a child that his mother had done something so awful that the police had to get involved? How do you make him understand without destroying his relationship with his parents? "Tommy," I said, leaning closer to the phone, "your mom sent us something that scared us very badly. We had to call the police to make sure everyone was safe. She said it was just a joke. She said you guys overreacted because you don't love us anymore." The manipulation in that statement was breathtaking. Even from a motel room, wherever they were, Samantha was poisoning her children against us, making us the villains in a story where we were actually the victims. "That's not true, Tommy," Jessica said firmly. "We love you and Sarah more than you could ever know. That will never change no matter what happens with your mom and dad." "Then why can't we see you? Mom says you don't want us around anymore because we cost too much money." I felt a surge of anger so intense it made my hands shake. To use children as weapons to twist their love for their grandparents into something ugly and painful, it was beyond cruel. It was evil. "Tommy, listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "None of this is your fault or Sarah's fault. Your grandmother and I love you both completely. We're dealing with some grown-up problems right now, but that doesn't change how we feel about you kids." "But when will we see you again?" Jessica looked at me helplessly. The honest answer was that we didn't know. With Samantha and Peter apparently on the run with restraining orders that couldn't be served with the whole family dynamic blown to pieces, we had no idea when, or if, we'd see our grandchildren again. "Soon," Jessica lied, and I could hear her heart breaking in that single word. "We hope it will be soon." "Tommy." We could hear Samantha's voice in the background, sharp and angry. "Get off that phone right now." "I have to go," Tommy whispered quickly. "I love you, Grandma. I love you, Grandpa." The line went dead. Jessica set the phone down and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I moved to the couch and held her, but there was no comfort I could offer. Our grandchildren were somewhere out there, scared and confused, being fed lies about why their family had fallen apart, and there wasn't a thing we could do about it. That evening, Margaret Summers called with an update on the restraining order. "Judge Harrison signed it," she said, "but obviously we still have the problem of serving it." "I've been in contact with the sheriff's department in 3 surrounding counties, and they're all on alert. Your daughter and son-in-law can't run forever." "What about the criminal charges?" I asked. "The DA is reviewing the case. Sending live animals through the mail is definitely illegal, and the threatening phone call afterward could be charged as harassment or intimidation. But they'll want to question Samantha and Peter first, and that can't happen until they're located." After Margaret hung up, Jessica and I tried to have dinner, but neither of us had much appetite. The house felt too quiet, too empty. We'd grown used to the chaos of Samantha's demands and Peter's threats, the constant crisis management that had defined our relationship with them for the past 5 years. Now, in the absence of that chaos, we didn't quite know what to do with ourselves. "Maybe we should take a trip," Jessica said suddenly. We were sitting at the kitchen table, picking at the grilled chicken and vegetables that had seemed like a good idea when she'd started cooking, but now tasted like cardboard. "A trip. Get away from here for a while. Visit your sister in Colorado, maybe. Or we could take that cruise we've been talking about for years. Just not be here waiting for the next horrible thing to happen." It was tempting. The idea of waking up somewhere else, somewhere without the weight of 40 years of memories and recent trauma, had definite appeal. But it also felt like running away, like letting Samantha and Peter win by driving us from our own home. "Let's think about it," I said, "after we get through the legal stuff." That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Jessica tossed and turned beside me. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind in the trees outside our bedroom window, a car driving slowly down our street, the house settling around us. I found myself straining to hear something that might indicate someone was outside, someone watching, someone planning whatever came next in this nightmare. Around 2 in the morning, Jessica sat up suddenly. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I listened intently, but heard nothing out of the ordinary. "What?" "I thought I heard a car door slam." We both got up and crept to the bedroom window, peering through the blinds at our front yard. The street was empty, bathed in the orange glow of the streetlights, but I could feel Jessica's fear radiating beside me like heat from a furnace. "There's nothing there," I said softly, but I didn't feel convinced myself. "William, I can't live like this, jumping at every sound, afraid to answer the phone, wondering if they're going to show up in our backyard with something worse than a snake." I put my arm around her shoulders and led her back to bed. But I knew she was right. This wasn't living. It was existing in a state of constant fear and vigilance. And the worst part was that we had no idea how long it would last or what it might escalate to. The next morning brought a new horror. Jessica found it when she went out to get the newspaper. A dead rat on our front porch, positioned carefully next to the welcome mat with its head twisted at an unnatural angle. Pinned to its body with a small nail was a note written in Samantha's familiar handwriting, "Rats always get what they deserve." This time, we didn't hesitate to call the police. Officer Thompson arrived within 10 minutes, took photos of the rat and the note, and added it to what was becoming a substantial file on our family situation. "This is escalating," he said grimly. "First the snake, now this. The note is clearly a threat, and the fact that they were able to get onto your property without being detected is concerning." "What can we do?" Jessica asked. She'd been unusually quiet since discovering the rat, and I could see that this latest incident had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. "I'm going to recommend that you install security cameras," Officer Thompson said. "Motion-activated lights, too. We'll also increase patrols in this neighborhood, but we can't have someone here 24 hours a day." After he left, Jessica and I drove to the home improvement store and spent $300 on security equipment. It felt surreal, at our age, installing cameras and motion sensors to protect ourselves from our own daughter. But as I mounted the first camera above our front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were closing the barn door after the horses had already escaped. That afternoon, Margaret Summers called with more bad news. "I've heard back from the DA's office," she said. "Without being able to question Samantha and Peter, they're reluctant to file formal charges. The evidence is strong, but they want to hear their side of the story before proceeding." "What does that mean for us?" "It means you're in limbo until they're found. The restraining order is still valid, but it's just paper if we can't serve it." The frustration was overwhelming. Here we were, the victims of what was clearly a campaign of harassment and intimidation, but the system seemed designed to protect the rights of people who had vanished, rather than the safety of people who were being terrorized. 2 days later, the phone calls started. It began with heavy breathing on the other end of the line when Jessica answered, then escalated to whispered threats and obscenities. The calls came at all hours, 6 in the morning, 11 at night, 3 in the afternoon. We started screening everything through the answering machine, but the messages the callers left were even worse than the live calls. "You think you're safe in that house, you old bastard? You think your precious police can protect you? We know what time you go to bed. We know what time you wake up. We know when you're alone. This is just the beginning. Every day for the rest of your pathetic lives, you're going to wonder what's coming next." The voices were disguised. Sometimes Peter's voice run through what sounded like a computer program. Sometimes Samantha speaking in an exaggerated whisper. Sometimes voices we didn't recognize at all. But the message was always the same. We were being watched. We were vulnerable, and this was far from over. Officer Martinez helped us set up call tracing through the phone company, but the calls were coming from different numbers each time. Probably prepaid cell phones that could be discarded after use. It was sophisticated harassment, planned and methodical. "They're escalating," he confirmed during one of his increasingly frequent visits to our house. "The dead animal, now the phone calls." Usually in these domestic situations, there's a triggering event that pushes things to the next level. "What kind of triggering event?" Jessica asked. "Could be anything. Running out of money, getting arrested for something else, finding out about the restraining order. Or it could just be that they're getting bored with the psychological warfare and ready to move to something more direct. More direct. The phrase sent a chill down my spine. What was more direct than a live snake and a dead rat? What came after threatening phone calls and notes promising revenge? I was about to find out. 3 weeks after the snake incident, I was working in our backyard garden. Something that had always been therapeutic for me, but now felt like an act of defiance against the fear that had taken over our lives. Jessica was inside making lunch, and for a few minutes bent over the tomato plants in the afternoon sunshine, I almost felt normal again. That's when I heard the gate latch click. Our backyard was surrounded by a 6-foot privacy fence, with gates on either side of the house. I'd made sure both gates were locked after Officer Thompson's visit, but as I straightened up and looked toward the sound, I saw the east gate swinging slowly open. Peter Morrison stepped into our backyard like he owned the place. He looked different than the last time I'd seen him. Thinner, unshaven, with the kind of manic energy that comes from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty, and there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something that made my blood run cold. "Hello, Bill," he said conversationally, as if he'd just stopped by to chat about the weather. "Nice garden you've got here. Shame if something happened to it." I straightened slowly, my mind racing. The house was 30 feet away, but Peter was between me and the back door. My cell phone was in my pocket, but he was close enough that any sudden movement might provoke him into doing something we'd both regret. "You're violating the restraining order," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Peter laughed, a sound with no humor in it at all. "What restraining order? Nobody ever served me with any restraining order. Far as I know, I'm just visiting my wife's dear old dad." He started walking slowly toward me, and I could see that he was holding something in his right hand, something that caught the sunlight and gleamed. A knife. "Peter, whatever you're thinking of doing, this isn't going to solve anything." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, old man. This is going to solve everything. You see, Samantha and I have been talking, and we've come to the conclusion that you and Jessica are the root of all our problems. You turned our kids against us. You ruined our credit. You destroyed our marriage. Everything bad that's happened to us can be traced back to you two." He was close enough now that I could smell him. Unwashed clothes and stale alcohol, and something else. Something medicinal and sharp. Drugs, maybe, or just the smell of someone whose life had completely fallen apart. "That's not true, Peter, and you know it." "Don't tell me what I know." The conversational tone was gone now, replaced by the kind of rage that had been building for weeks. "You think you're so much better than us, don't you? Sitting in your nice house with your nice retirement, looking down on the people who actually struggle, who actually have real problems." The knife in his hand was a hunting knife about 6 inches long with a serrated edge. He wasn't making any aggressive moves with it yet, but I could see his grip tightening and loosening like he was working up the courage to use it. "Where are Tommy and Sarah?" I asked, hoping to redirect his attention to something that might calm him down. "Safe. Away from you. They finally understand what kind of people their grandparents really are." "Peter, listen to me. Put the knife down and we'll talk about this. Whatever problems you and Samantha are having, we can work through them. But not like this. Work through them." His voice rose to a near shout. "You mean like we worked through them when you cut us off without warning? Like we worked through them when you called the cops on us? Like we worked through them when you tried to have us arrested?" He was advancing steadily now, and I was running out of room to retreat. Behind me was the garden fence, and to either side were flower beds that would trip me up if I tried to run. My only hope was to keep him talking and pray that Jessica would realize something was wrong and call for help. "The snake was over the line," I said. "You had to know we couldn't just ignore something like that." "The snake was a gift," Peter spat. "A perfect representation of what you are. Cold-blooded, dangerous, something that doesn't belong in a normal person's house. But you couldn't appreciate the symbolism, could you? You had to turn it into some big federal case." "Peter, shut up." He raised the knife, pointing it directly at my chest. "You've done enough talking. 40 years of talking, of telling Samantha what to do and how to live and who to marry. Well, guess what? Your talking days are over." That's when I heard the back door slam, and Jessica's voice sharp with panic. "William, get away from him!" Peter spun around distracted for just a moment, and I saw my chance. Instead of running toward the house, which would have put Jessica in danger, I dove sideways toward the garden shed, hoping to put some solid barrier between us. I almost made it. The knife caught me in the left shoulder as I rolled a white hot line of pain that made me gasp and stumble. I crashed into the side of the shed and went down my left arm, suddenly useless blood soaking through my shirt. "William!" Jessica was screaming now, but I could also hear her on the phone. 911. I need police and paramedics at 1247 Maple Avenue. My husband is being attacked. Peter stood over me breathing hard, the knife still in his hand and now stained with my blood. For a moment I thought he was going to finish what he'd started, but then we both heard the sirens in the distance growing rapidly closer. "This isn't over," he said, backing toward the gate. "You think the police can protect you forever? You think this is the worst thing that can happen to you? You have no idea what we're capable of." He turned and ran, disappearing through the gate and leaving me bleeding in my own backyard while the woman I'd loved for 43 years knelt beside me, pressing her sweater against my shoulder to stop the bleeding. The paramedics arrived first, followed closely by what seemed like half the police force. As they worked on my shoulder and loaded me into the ambulance, I could see officers swarming through our neighborhood, searching for Peter with dogs and helicopters. But he was gone, vanished once again into whatever shadowy existence he and Samantha had created for themselves, after abandoning their normal lives to pursue this campaign of revenge against us. In the emergency room, as a doctor stitched up the knife wound that had come within inches of severing a major artery, Jessica held my good hand and whispered the words that both of us had been thinking, but neither had been willing to say out loud. "They're trying to kill us, William. Our own daughter and her husband are trying to kill us." I squeezed her hand as tightly as I could and stared up at the fluorescent lights of the trauma bay, finally understanding that the people who had once been our family had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The war wasn't escalating anymore. The war had officially begun. The hospital bed felt like a fortress, but I knew it was an illusion. Even with a police officer stationed outside my room and my left arm in a sling that made every movement a reminder of how close I'd come to dying in my own backyard, I couldn't shake the feeling that Peter and Samantha were out there somewhere planning their next move. Detective Ray Kowalski was a different breed from the patrol officers we'd been dealing with. Tall and lean with graying temples and the kind of weathered face that spoke of 30 years dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. He sat beside my bed with a thick file folder and the focused attention of a man who'd seen this movie before and knew how it usually ended. "Mr. Carr," he said, his voice carrying a slight Chicago accent. "I've been reviewing your case from the beginning. The snake, the dead rat, the threatening calls, now this assault. We're dealing with a coordinated campaign of escalating violence, and I need you to understand something. People like your daughter and son-in-law don't usually stop on their own." Jessica squeezed my good hand tighter. She'd been at my bedside for 6 hours straight, refusing to go home even when the doctor assured her I was out of immediate danger. Her eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion and fear, but there was something else there now, a hardness I'd never seen before. "What are our options?" she asked. "Well, the good news is that we finally have Peter Morrison on assault with a deadly weapon, which is a felony. The bad news is that he's still in the wind along with your daughter. We've got bolos out in 6 states, and their photos are being distributed to every law enforcement agency in the region." Detective Kowalski opened his file and pulled out several photographs. Crime scene photos from our backyard showing the blood on the shed where I'd fallen, the knife Peter had dropped in his haste to escape the trampled flowers where we'd struggled. "The knife had his prints on it," the detective continued. "Clean match in the system. Turns out Mr. Morrison has a prior arrest for domestic violence in Nevada 3 years ago. Charges were dropped when the victim recanted, but it establishes a pattern." "What about Samantha?" I asked. "Can you charge her with anything?" "That's trickier. She wasn't present during the assault, and proving conspiracy requires evidence that she was directly involved in planning it. But the snake incident, the phone calls, we're building a case. The problem is finding them. A nurse came in to check my vitals and adjust my pain medication, and during the brief interruption, I found myself staring out the hospital room window at the parking lot below. Somewhere out there, my daughter was hiding, planning, nursing her hatred like a cancer. The little girl who had once fallen asleep in my arms was now actively working to destroy me. "Detective," Jessica said after the nurse left, "what would happen if they came after us again? What if next time they don't run away?" Kowalski's expression grew grimmer. "Mrs. Carr, I'm not going to lie to you. We're dealing with two people who have abandoned their normal lives, cut all ties to conventional society, and focused entirely on revenge against you and your husband. That makes them extremely dangerous and completely unpredictable." He leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his knees, speaking in the careful tone of someone delivering very bad news. "In my experience, family violence cases like this typically end in one of three ways. Either the perpetrators are caught and prosecuted, which is what we're working toward, or they eventually burn out and move on to other targets, which seems unlikely given the personal nature of their grievances against you. Or," he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. We all knew what the third option was. "We need to talk about protection," he continued. "Long-term protection. You can't live in a hospital forever, and when you go home, you're going to be vulnerable." "What kind of protection?" I asked. "Well, we can increase patrol frequency in your neighborhood, but we can't provide round-the-clock security. That's just not realistic with our budget and manpower. You might want to consider hiring private security, at least temporarily." The idea of paying strangers to protect us from our own family was almost too absurd to contemplate. But as I shifted position in the hospital bed and felt the sharp reminder of the knife wound in my shoulder, absurd began to seem reasonable. "There's something else," Detective Kowalski said, pulling out another photograph. This one showed a motel room that looked like it had been ransacked. Clothes scattered everywhere, furniture overturned, holes punched in the drywall. "We found where they'd been staying. Place called the Sunset Motor Inn, about 40 miles south of here. Manager said they checked out in a hurry 3 days ago, right after your attack, Mr. Carr." "Did you find anything?" "Some interesting things, actually. Notebooks with detailed information about your daily routines, what time you usually left for the grocery store, when you worked in your garden, Jessica's schedule at the library. They'd been watching you for weeks, maybe months." The violation of that knowledge hit me like a physical blow. While Jessica and I had been trying to rebuild our lives after cutting off Samantha's financial support, they'd been out there in the shadows studying us like prey animals, learning our patterns and vulnerabilities. "There were also maps," the detective continued. "Not just of your neighborhood, but of routes to your house from different directions, sketches of your property, showing sight lines and escape paths. This wasn't impulsive, Mr. Carr. This was planned." Jessica made a small sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. "My God, William, they were stalking us." "There's more." Detective Kowalski pulled out what looked like photocopies of handwritten pages. They kept journals, detailed records of every perceived slight, every grievance going back years. "Your daughter wrote extensively about how you and Jessica had betrayed her, how you'd stolen her children's inheritance, how you needed to be punished for destroying her family." He handed me one of the photocopies, and I recognized Samantha's handwriting immediately. The same neat cursive she'd used for school reports and birthday cards when she was a child. But the words on the page were poison. "Day 23 watched them through the kitchen window while they had breakfast. They look so peaceful, so content with their stolen comfort. They have no idea what's coming. They think they can destroy our lives and just go on living their perfect little retirement. But justice is coming. Justice for what they did to Tommy and Sarah, for what they did to Peter, for what they did to me. Tomorrow, we escalate." I set the paper down with shaking hands. This wasn't mental illness or temporary insanity. This was calculated hatred, methodically planned and carefully executed. "The journal entries span several weeks," Detective Kowalski said. "They document not just surveillance, but planning. Different scenarios for teaching you a lesson, as your daughter puts it. The snake was apparently just the opening move in a much larger campaign." "What were the other scenarios?" Jessica asked, though I could tell from her voice that she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Fire was mentioned several times, poisoning your food or water supply, kidnapping one of you to force the other to comply with their demands, and," he hesitated, glancing between Jessica and me, "there were detailed discussions about making it look like an accident. Home invasion gone wrong, carbon monoxide leak car accident on a lonely road." The room felt like it was spinning around me. My own daughter, the child I'd raised and loved and protected for 37 years, had been planning to murder me. To murder Jessica. Not in a moment of rage or desperation, but as a carefully considered solution to her financial problems. "Mr. Carr, are you all right?" The detective was looking at me with concern, and I realized my heart rate monitor was beeping more rapidly. "I need a minute," I managed. Detective Kowalski nodded and gathered up his papers. "I'll give you some time to process this. But we need to talk about next steps. You're being discharged tomorrow morning, and we need to have a security plan in place before you leave this hospital." After he left, Jessica and I sat in silence for a long time. The steady beep of the monitors and the distant sounds of hospital activity seemed to come from another world, a normal world where daughters didn't plot to kill their parents and families didn't destroy themselves with hatred. "I keep thinking about the children," Jessica finally said. "Where are Tommy and Sarah while all this is happening? What are they being told about why their parents are living in motels and running from the police?" It was a question that had been haunting me too. Were they being dragged along on this campaign of revenge, forced to watch their parents descend into criminality and violence? Or had Samantha and Peter stashed them somewhere, maybe with friends or relatives, while they pursued their vendetta? Detective Kowalski said Child Services is looking into it. I said, "If they can find the kids, they'll make sure they're safe." "Safe from their own parents," Jessica said bitterly. "What kind of world is this, William? What kind of people have we raised?" I didn't have an answer because I'd been asking myself the same question since that first phone call demanding money 5 years ago. At what point had we failed as parents? When should we have seen the warning signs that our daughter was capable of this level of cruelty? Dr. Patricia Morrison, no relation to Peter, despite the unfortunate coincidence of the name, came in to check on my wound and discuss the discharge plan. She was a compact woman in her 50s with the efficient bedside manner of someone who'd seen every kind of trauma the human body could endure. "The knife missed the major arteries," she explained, "but it did significant muscle damage. You're going to need physical therapy, and full range of motion might take several months to return. More importantly, you're going to be limited in what you can do physically during the healing process." "What does that mean practically?" Jessica asked. "It means Mr. Carr won't be able to drive safely, lift anything heavy, or defend himself effectively if attacked again. Given what I understand about your situation from the police, that's a significant concern." Limited mobility, reduced ability to protect myself, or Jessica, trapped in a house that had already been breached once by people who wanted us dead. The tactical disadvantages were overwhelming. "Doctor, what?" I said, "What would you recommend?" "From a safety standpoint." "Honestly, if someone was actively trying to kill me, I wouldn't go home at all. I'd find somewhere safe to stay until the threat was neutralized." That night, alone with my thoughts, while Jessica dozed in the reclining chair she'd refused to leave, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. We couldn't go home. Not yet, maybe not ever. Our house, our neighborhood, our entire life had been compromised by people who knew our routines and had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence. When Jessica woke up around midnight, I told her what I'd been thinking. "You want us to run away?" she asked. "I want us to survive. If we go back to Maple Avenue, we're sitting ducks. They know everything about that house, how to get in where we sleep when we're most vulnerable." Detective Kowalski was right. We need protection. Real protection until they're caught. Jessica was quiet for a long time, staring out the dark hospital window. "Where would we go?" "I don't know. Maybe a hotel in another city, at least temporarily. Maybe stay with your sister in Phoenix until this is resolved." "For how long?" "However long it takes." The next morning brought a development none of us had anticipated. Detective Kowalski arrived at my room looking grimmer than usual, carrying a manila envelope that I somehow knew contained very bad news. "We found them," he said without preamble. Jessica looked up from the breakfast tray she'd been trying to get me to eat. "Where?" "They're dead, Mrs. Carr, both of them. Peter and your daughter. A farmer found their car in a drainage ditch about 60 miles west of here. Murder-suicide from the looks of it." The words hit me like a physical blow. Dead. Samantha was dead. My daughter, my little girl, The child who had once believed I could fix anything and protect her from everything was gone. What happened? Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. Best we can reconstruct, Peter shot your daughter, then turned the gun on himself. This was sometime Tuesday night based on the coroner's preliminary examination. Detective Kowalski sat down heavily in the chair beside my bed. I've been doing this for 28 years, and I still can't understand what drives people to these extremes. Tuesday night. While I'd been lying in this hospital bed feeling sorry for myself and planning our escape, my daughter had been dying in a car on some lonely farm road, killed by the man she'd partnered with in her campaign against us. Were the children with them? Jessica asked, her voice shaking. No. We found them this morning at a truck stop about 100 miles south. They'd been there for 3 days, living off vending machine food and sleeping in the restroom. A waitress finally called social services. Tommy and Sarah abandoned and alone, waiting for parents who would never come back. The image of my grandchildren scared and confused in a truck stop bathroom was almost more than I could bear. Are they all right? Physically, yes. Emotionally, Detective Kowalski shrugged. They're going to need a lot of help. Child Services is arranging temporary foster care while they sort out custody issues. Custody issues. I sat up straighter, ignoring the pain in my shoulder. They're our grandchildren. Mr. Carr, I understand your feelings, but there are procedures. Background checks, home studies, interviews. The children have been through severe trauma, and the state has to ensure they're placed in a safe, stable environment. Safer than with us. Jessica's voice had an edge I'd rarely heard. We're the ones who've been trying to protect them from their parents' insanity. I know, and that will certainly be taken into consideration. But the process takes time, and in the meantime, the children need immediate care. After Detective Kowalski left, Jessica and I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the fact that our family nightmare was over but had ended in the worst possible way. Samantha was dead. Peter was dead. Our grandchildren were in state custody, and we were alone with the wreckage of relationships that had once meant everything to us. I should feel relieved, Jessica said finally. The threat is over. We can go home. We can sleep without wondering if someone's watching us. We can answer the phone without fear. But all I feel is empty. I knew exactly what she meant. For months, our lives had been consumed by the crisis with Samantha and Peter. Every decision, every conversation, every moment of our day had been filtered through the lens of their harassment and violence. Now suddenly it was over. Not through resolution or reconciliation, but through death. We were safe, but we were also alone in a way we'd never been before. She was still our daughter, I said quietly. Even after everything she did, even after the snake and the threats and the knife, she was still our little girl. And now she's gone. Jessica reached for my hand. We failed her somehow, didn't we? All those years of giving her money, of enabling her bad choices, of hoping she'd change. We failed to save her from herself. Or maybe we loved her too much, I replied. Maybe if we'd been tougher, if we'd set better boundaries earlier, if we'd forced her to face consequences instead of always bailing her out. But that was a conversation that would go nowhere because dead people don't get second chances and broken families don't get do-overs. Samantha was gone, and with her went any possibility of understanding why she'd chosen hatred over love, violence over peace, destruction over redemption. The hospital social worker, Ms. Rodriguez, came by that afternoon to discuss the children's situation. She was a kind-faced woman with salt and pepper hair and the patient manner of someone who'd delivered difficult news to families in crisis many times before. Tommy and Sarah are asking for you, she said. They don't fully understand what's happened to their parents yet. We're working with child psychologists on how to explain it in age-appropriate terms. But they know you're their grandparents and they want to see you. Can we see them? Jessica asked immediately. Not immediately. There are protocols interviews that need to happen first, but I want you to know that their request to live with you is being taken very seriously. Your family, you have no history of violence or instability, and frankly, given what these children have been through, familiar faces are exactly what they need. How long? I asked. If everything goes smoothly, maybe a week or two for temporary custody while we complete the full evaluation for permanent placement. But I have to be honest, the children are going to need extensive counseling. What they've witnessed, what they've been put through, it's going to affect them for a long time. After Miss Rodriguez left Jessica, and I began making lists of what we'd need to do if Tommy and Sarah came to live with us. Convert the spare bedroom and the office into proper children's rooms. Enroll them in new schools. Find therapists who specialized in childhood trauma. Figure out how two people in their late 60s were going to raise traumatized preteens while dealing with their own grief and recovery. But underneath the practical concerns was a deeper question. How do you help children heal from wounds their own parents had inflicted not just on their grandparents, but on the very fabric of their family? They're going to have questions, Jessica said as we worked through the logistics. About why their parents did what they did, about why they died, about whether it was somehow their fault. We'll figure it out, I said, though I had no idea how. How do you explain to a 12-year-old boy that his mother had been planning to kill his grandparents? How do you help a 9-year-old girl understand that her father had chosen murder over responsibility? The truth was, we were all going to be figuring it out together. 2 elderly grandparents and 2 traumatized children trying to build something resembling a family from the wreckage of the one that had been destroyed. On my discharge day, Jessica and I drove home to Maple Avenue for the first time since the attack. The house looked exactly the same. Peaceful, well-maintained, surrounded by the flower beds I'd been tending when Peter Morrison had walked through our gate with a knife. But it felt different somehow, smaller and more fragile, like a stage set that had been designed to look like safety, but was actually made of painted cardboard. "It's just a house," Jessica said as we stood in the driveway, both of us reluctant to go inside. "It's not haunted. They're gone, William. They can't hurt us anymore." She was right. But it still took me a long time to work up the courage to walk into our backyard. The blood had been cleaned up, the flowers replanted, the gate fitted with a new lock. But I could still see Peter standing there with his knife, still feel the white-hot line of pain as the blade found its mark. Still hear Jessica screaming my name. "We could sell it," I said. "Move somewhere new, somewhere without all these memories." Jessica considered this, walking slowly around the garden where I'd nearly died. "Or we could stay and reclaim it, make new memories, better memories. With Tommy and Sarah. The idea had appeal, turning our house from a crime scene back into a home, filling it with the sound of children's laughter instead of the echoes of threats and violence. But it would also mean living forever with the knowledge of what had happened here, the understanding that our own daughter had helped plan my murder in the same garden where I'd taught her to plant seeds when she was 6 years old. That evening, Detective Kowalski called with final details about the investigation. The murder-suicide had been straightforward enough. Peter had shot Samantha once in the head, then turned the gun on himself. But they'd also found additional evidence in the car that painted a clearer picture of their final days together. "More journals," he said. "Looks like they'd been fighting about the plan to escalate violence against you and your wife. Your daughter was apparently having second thoughts, especially about how it would affect the children. Peter was pushing for more direct action." "What kind of direct action?" "The final journal entry was written by your daughter the day before they died. She said she wanted to call off the whole thing, that she was ready to turn herself in and face the consequences for what they'd already done. Peter's entry from the same day said he'd never let that happen. So in the end, Samantha had tried to choose her children over her hatred, tried to choose redemption over revenge. But it was too late. The man she'd partnered with in her campaign against us had become the instrument of her own destruction. "There's something else you should know," Detective Kowalski continued. "We found evidence that Peter had been drugging your daughter. Prescription medications, probably to keep her compliant and focused on the revenge plan. Blood tests confirmed she had significant levels of methamphetamine and prescription stimulants in her system at the time of death. The information hit me like a punch to the stomach. My daughter hadn't just been consumed by hatred. She'd been systematically poisoned by a man who'd used her legitimate grievances as an excuse to drag her into his own darkness. Not that it excused what she'd done, but it helped explain how the child I'd raised had become someone capable of sending us a snake of planning our deaths." "Detective," I said, "do you think, if we'd handled things differently, could we have saved her?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Mr. Carr, I've seen a lot of domestic violence cases over the years, and I can tell you this. By the time it gets to the point where someone's stalking their own family and planning murders, the opportunities for intervention are pretty much gone. What happened to your daughter was tragic, but it wasn't your fault. After I hung up Jessica and I sat in our living room, the same room where we'd watched Animal Control remove a python from our coffee table just weeks earlier, and tried to make sense of everything we'd learned. Our daughter had been drugged and manipulated, but she'd still made choices that led to violence and death. She'd tried to turn back at the end, but too late to save herself or repair the damage she'd caused. Most importantly, she'd left behind 2 children who were now our responsibility, 2 young lives that somehow had to be rebuilt from the ruins of their parents' mutual destruction. When do we tell them the truth, Jessica asked, about what their parents did, about how they died? I don't know. Maybe never. Maybe we let them remember Samantha as someone who loved them, even if she lost her way. But what about when they're older? What about when they ask questions? I didn't have an answer because I was still asking questions myself. Questions about where we'd gone wrong as parents, about whether love was enough to overcome mental illness and drug addiction and the kind of consuming hatred that had destroyed our family. Questions about whether 2 68-year-olds had the strength and wisdom to raise traumatized children while carrying their own scars from the war their parents had waged against us. But as I sat there holding Jessica's hand in the quiet of our house, our safe house finally, I knew we'd find a way to try. Because Tommy and Sarah were all that remained of our family now, and protecting them was the only way to make sense of everything we'd lost. Outside, the sun was setting over the neighborhood where we'd lived for 20 years, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of better times, simpler times, when the biggest worry in our lives was whether the tomatoes would ripen before the first frost. Tomorrow we'd start the process of becoming parents again, at an age when we'd thought our child-rearing days were long behind us. We'd learn about trauma counseling and custody procedures and how to help children heal from wounds we could barely comprehend. But tonight, for the first time in months, we were safe. The phones wouldn't ring with threats. No one would leave dead animals on our porch. No one would break into our backyard with a knife and hatred in their eyes. The war was finally over, and somehow against all odds we had survived. The silence stretched too long. Jessica and I had been sitting in Margaret Summers' office for what felt like an eternity, staring at documents that would reshape our lives forever. The late afternoon sun slanted through the Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across the mahogany desk where our future lay spelled out in legal terminology and notarized signatures. "This is it, then," I said finally, my voice hoarse from the weight of what we were about to do. "We're really going to disinherit our own daughter." Margaret looked up from the revised will she'd been preparing, her steel-gray eyes compassionate but firm. "Mr. Carr, your daughter is dead. What we're doing here is protecting your grandchildren from the consequences of their parents' choices." She was right, of course. But saying the words out loud, officially removing Samantha from our will, redirecting her inheritance to an education trust for Tommy and Sarah, felt like killing her all over again. Even after everything she'd done, even after the snake and the threats and the knife that had left me with a scar I'd carry for the rest of my life, the act of writing her out of our lives felt like the final betrayal. "The trust will be untouchable." Margaret continued gathering the papers into neat stacks. "No one can access these funds except for legitimate educational expenses. Tuition books, room and board at accredited institutions. Even if someone else gains custody of the children, even if they marry young or make poor financial decisions, this money will be there for their futures." Jessica reached across the space between our chairs and took my good hand. My left shoulder still ached constantly, a reminder of how close we'd all come to a very different ending to this story. "It's what she would have wanted," Jessica said quietly. "Before everything went wrong, before Peter and the gambling and all the hatred, Samantha loved those children. She would have wanted them to have opportunities." I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that somewhere inside the woman who'd sent us a snake and helped plan our murders there had still been the mother who used to read bedtime stories to Tommy and braid Sarah's hair with infinite patience. But believing it required forgetting everything I'd learned about what she'd become, and forgetting felt like dishonoring the truth of what we'd all lived through. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, pulling out a thick manila envelope. "The restraining order paperwork. Obviously, it's moot now, given the circumstances, but I wanted to make sure you had copies for your records. The restraining order that had never been served. The legal protection that had arrived too late to protect anyone from anything. I took the envelope anyway because some part of me needed the physical proof that we'd tried to do things the right way. Tried to use the system to keep our family safe before everything spiraled beyond anyone's control. As we left Margaret's office, Jessica stopped on the sidewalk outside the converted Victorian and looked back at the building where we'd just legally erased our daughter from our future. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" she asked. "I think we're doing the only thing we can do," I replied. Tommy and Sarah deserve better than what their parents left them. They deserve a future that isn't poisoned by all this hatred and violence. But as we drove home through the familiar streets of our neighborhood, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trying to control forces that were far beyond our understanding. Two traumatized children, a family destroyed by mental illness and addiction, and two 68-year-olds who were about to become parents again, whether we were ready or not. The call from Miss Rodriguez came 3 days later while Jessica was in the garden trying to restore the flower bed that had been trampled during my attack. I watched her through the kitchen window as she knelt among the damaged plants, her silver hair catching the morning sunlight, and for a moment I could almost pretend that our lives were still normal. "Mr. Carr." The social worker's voice was warm but professional. "I have good news. The preliminary custody evaluation has been approved. Tommy and Sarah can come home with you this afternoon, pending the completion of the full home study." Home. The word carried so much weight now. Home to a house where their grandfather had been stabbed by their stepfather. Home to grandparents who were old enough to be their great-grandparents. Home to a family that existed now only because everyone else was dead. "How are they doing?" I asked. "They're adjusting. The foster family has been wonderful, but the children have been asking for you and Mrs. Carr constantly. They need familiar faces, familiar routines. They need to feel like they belong somewhere." "What have they been told about their parents?" Miss Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. "The truth age appropriately. They know their parents died in a car accident. They know their mom and dad had been having problems, and that's why they were staying in motels. But the details about the violence, about the stalking, and the attempts on your lives, we felt that could wait until they're older and better able to process it. A car accident. It was a lie, but it was a merciful lie. Someday Tommy and Sarah would be old enough to handle the full truth about their parents' final months. But today, they were just two scared children who needed stability and love more than they needed honesty about murder, suicide, and drug-fueled revenge fantasies. There will be conditions," Ms. Rodriguez continued. "Mandatory counseling for the children, regular check-ins with our office, and you'll both need to complete a parenting refresher course designed for grandparents in kinship care situations." Parenting refresher course. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. Jessica and I had raised one child, and look how that had turned out. Maybe we did need to learn new approaches, better techniques, ways to help children heal from trauma we'd never had to deal with when Samantha was young. "When do we pick them up?" 3 o'clock. I'll meet you at the foster home and help with the transition." After I hung up, I walked outside to where Jessica was still working in the garden. She looked up as I approached, her face streaked with dirt and her eyes bright with something that might have been hope. "They're coming home today," I said. Jessica's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. She burst into tears, not the bitter tears of grief and fear that had marked so much of the past month, but tears of relief and joy and something approaching redemption. I knelt beside her in the flower bed, ignoring the protest from my healing shoulder, and held her while she cried. "We get another chance," she whispered against my chest. "We get to be grandparents instead of victims. We get to help them heal. We get to try," I corrected gently. "But Jessica, we have to be realistic about what we're taking on. These children have been through hell. Their parents are dead. They've been living in foster care, and now they're coming to live with people they barely know in a house where violence happened. It's going to be hard." She pulled back and looked at me with the kind of determination I remembered from 40 years ago when she'd taken on the challenge of being a young mother with the same fierce protectiveness she was showing now. "Then we'll learn how to make it easier. We'll get them counseling. We'll baby-proof the house, even though they're not babies anymore. We'll do whatever it takes to make them feel safe and loved." That afternoon, driving to the foster home in suburban Millbrook, I found myself rehearsing conversations in my head. What do you say to a 12-year-old boy whose world has been turned upside down? How do you promise a 9-year-old girl that the adults in her life won't abandon her again when the last adults she trusted had done exactly that? The foster home was a modest ranch house with a well-maintained yard and the kind of generic cheerfulness that spoke of people who had made caring for other people's children their life's work. Mrs. Patterson, the foster mother, met us at the door with a smile that seemed genuinely warm despite the professional distance in her eyes. "They've been packed and ready since breakfast," she said, leading us into a living room where Tommy and Sarah sat on a floral couch with 2 small suitcases at their feet. Tommy had grown in the weeks since I'd seen him last. He looked older somehow, as if the trauma had aged him beyond his 12 years. His dark hair needed cutting, and there were shadows under his eyes that no child should have. But when he saw us, his face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd witnessed from him in months. "Grandpa, Grandma." Sarah launched herself off the couch and ran to Jessica, who caught her in a fierce hug that seemed to go on forever. My granddaughter felt smaller than I remembered, more fragile, but her embrace was strong and desperate in a way that broke my heart. Tommy was more reserved, approaching us with the careful dignity of a boy who was trying very hard to be the man of the family. He shook my hand formally, then seemed to remember that I was his grandfather, and allowed himself to be pulled into a one-armed hug that I made last as long as I could. "Are we really going to live with you now?" Sarah asked, pulling back from Jessica but staying close enough to maintain physical contact. "If you want to," Jessica said. "Would you like that?" "Yes." Sarah's response was immediate and emphatic. "I missed you so much. The foster people were nice, but they're not family." Tommy nodded his agreement, but I could see questions in his eyes that he wasn't ready to ask yet. Questions about why his parents had died, about what would happen to him and Sarah now, about whether Jessica and I could really be trusted not to disappear from their lives the way everyone else had. The ride home was quiet, with both children staring out the windows at neighborhoods they'd never seen before. We'd lived only about 30 miles from Samantha and Peter's house, but it might as well have been a different world. Tree-lined streets instead of apartment complexes, single-family homes with well-maintained yards instead of the rundown rental property where they'd spent their last months with their parents. "Will we have our own rooms?" Tommy asked as we pulled into our driveway. "You will," I said. "Grandma and I have been getting them ready for you." It was true, though, getting them ready had consisted mostly of moving boxes and buying twin beds and trying to figure out what 12 and 9-year-old children might need or want in their bedrooms. We'd never been the kind of grandparents who had the house set up for regular visits. Samantha and Peter had rarely brought the children over, and when they did, it was usually brief and focused on whatever financial crisis had prompted the visit. Jessica had chosen bedding in neutral colors and stocked the rooms with basic supplies, clothes in sizes we'd guessed at school supplies, a few books and games. But walking through the house with Tommy and Sarah, I realized how sterile and unfamiliar everything must seem to them. "This was your mom's room when she was your age," Jessica told Tommy as we stood in the doorway of what had been Samantha's childhood bedroom. We'd converted it to an office years ago, but Jessica had found some of Samantha's old things in the closet. Trophies from Little League school projects, photographs from happier times. Tommy walked over to the dresser where Jessica had arranged some of these mementos. He picked up a photo of Samantha at age 10, missing her 2 front teeth, and grinning at the camera from the seat of her first bicycle. "She looked like me," he said quietly. "She did. You have her smile and her stubborn streak." "Is that bad?" "The stubborn streak?" Jessica knelt down so she was at his eye level. "It can be good or bad depending on what you use it for. Your mom used hers to fight for things she believed in. Sometimes that got her in trouble, but sometimes it helped her protect the people she loved." It was a careful answer designed to preserve Tommy's memories of his mother without lying about the complexity of who she'd become. But I could see that he was processing it the way children do, looking for the truth beneath the adult words. Sarah's room was smaller but brighter, with windows that looked out over the backyard garden. Jessica had found some of Samantha's old stuffed animals and arranged them on the bed along with art supplies and picture books that seemed appropriate for a 9-year-old girl who'd been through too much too young. "Can I change things?" Sarah asked, standing in the middle of the room and turning slowly to take it all in. Can I put up my own pictures and move the bed where I want it? Of course, Jessica said. This is your room now. You can arrange it however makes you comfortable. That first evening was awkward, in the way that family gatherings always are when everyone is trying too hard to be normal. Jessica had prepared a simple dinner: spaghetti with meat sauce, garlic bread, a green salad that neither child touched. We sat around our dining room table, which suddenly felt enormous, with just the four of us, and made careful conversation about safe topics. School would start in 2 weeks. Tommy would be entering 7th grade, Sarah would be in 4th. Neither of them had attended school regularly during their parents' final months, so there would be placement tests and evaluations to determine what kind of academic support they might need. Will the other kids know? Tommy asked suddenly. About our parents being dead and us living with you. It was the first time either child had directly mentioned their parents' death, and the question hung in the air like a challenge. How much truth could a 12-year-old handle? How much privacy did he deserve? They'll know whatever you want them to know, I said. If you want to tell people your parents died and you're living with your grandparents, that's fine. If you want to keep it private, that's fine too. You get to decide how much of your story to share. Tommy nodded thoughtfully. I don't want them to feel sorry for me. People might feel sorry for you anyway, Jessica said gently. When bad things happen to children, adults often feel sad about it. But feeling sorry for someone isn't the same as thinking they're weak or broken. After dinner, we watched a movie together, some animated film about talking animals that Sarah had chosen. Tommy pretended it was too young for him, but I caught him laughing at the funny parts when he thought no one was looking. For 2 hours, sitting in our living room with the children cuddled up between Jessica and me on the couch, I could almost imagine that we were a normal family having a normal evening. But normal was an illusion we couldn't maintain. When it came time for bed, Sarah was afraid to sleep alone in her new room. She'd been having nightmares, she admitted, about her parents and about being abandoned again. Jessica ended up sleeping in Sarah's room that first night, curled up in the twin bed, while Sarah slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Tommy was quieter about his fears, but I could hear him moving around his room long after we'd said goodnight. When I checked on him around midnight, I found him sitting by the window staring out at the backyard where just weeks earlier his stepfather had tried to kill me. Can't sleep? I asked, settling into the chair Jessica had placed by his bed. It's too quiet, he said. At the foster home there were other kids, and before that in the motels there was always noise from other rooms or traffic or something. Here it's just quiet. Would you like me to leave a radio on, or we could open the window so you can hear the sounds from outside? He shook his head. Grandpa, can I ask you something? Of course. Why did Mom and Dad leave us at that truck stop? Why didn't they come back? The question I'd been dreading. The truth was too complicated and too cruel for a 12-year-old to understand. But lying felt like a betrayal of his intelligence and his right to know something about what had happened to his family. Your parents were having a lot of problems, I said carefully. Problems with money, problems with making good decisions, problems with some people they'd gotten involved with. They thought they were protecting you and Sarah by leaving you somewhere safe while they dealt with those problems. But they died in the car accident before they could come back. That's right. Tommy was quiet for a long time processing this explanation. Were you and Mom fighting before she died? Is that why we never saw you anymore? Another impossible question. How do you tell a child that his mother had been sending death threats to his grandparents? That she'd been planning to kill us? That the reason they hadn't seen us was because their parents had been consumed by a hatred so complete that it had destroyed everyone it touched? We were having disagreements, I said finally. Adult disagreements about money and responsibilities and how to help your family. Your mom was angry with us because we couldn't give her as much help as she wanted. But that doesn't mean we stopped loving her or stopped loving you and Sarah. She said you hated us. She said you thought we were too expensive and you didn't want us around anymore. The words hit me like a physical blow. Even at the end, even as she was planning our deaths, Samantha had been poisoning her children against us, making sure they understood that their grandparents were the enemy. That was never true, Tommy. Never. Your grandmother and I have loved you since the day you were born. We've wanted you in our lives always. The problems we had with your parents were never about you children. Then why didn't you come get us? When Mom and Dad were staying in all those motels and we were scared and hungry sometimes, why didn't you come help us? Because we didn't know I wanted to say, because your parents had cut us out of your lives completely, because we had no idea where you were or what you were going through, because we were too busy defending ourselves from their attacks to realize that you were suffering too. But saying any of that would have required explaining the full scope of what Samantha and Peter had done, and I wasn't ready to destroy Tommy's memories of his parents, complicated though they already were. We should have, I said instead, we should have found a way to help you sooner. I'm sorry we didn't. Tommy looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing my words against everything he'd experienced in the past months. Finally, he nodded and settled back into his bed. Grandpa, are you going to send us away if we're too much trouble? Never. I said and meant it with every fiber of my being. You and Sarah are family. This is your home now for as long as you want it to be. The next few weeks fell into a routine of sorts. Counseling appointments twice a week for both children. Tommy with Dr. Mitchell, a specialist in adolescent trauma, and Sarah with Dr. Wang, who had a gift for helping young children process grief and loss through art and play therapy. Jessica and I attended our own sessions with a family counselor who helped us understand the unique challenges of raising grandchildren who'd been through severe trauma. School registration was more complicated than I'd expected. Both children were behind academically. Tommy was reading at about a 5th grade level despite his age, and Sarah had missed so much school that she was struggling with basic math concepts. But their new teachers were compassionate and experienced with children from difficult backgrounds, and slowly both kids began to find their footing. The first real crisis came 3 weeks after they'd moved in with us. I was helping Tommy with his homework, 7th grade social studies that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the sense it made to either of us, when he suddenly threw his pencil across the room and burst into tears. "I can't do this," he sobbed. "I'm too stupid. Mom was right. I'm never going to amount to anything." The words were heartbreaking enough, but the fury behind them was what really scared me. This wasn't just frustration with homework. This was rage at the world, at his parents, at the circumstances that had put him in this position. Jessica appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of Tommy's distress. She took one look at the scene, the thrown pencil, the scattered papers, the 12-year-old boy crying with the kind of despair that belonged on much older faces, and sat down on the floor next to his chair. "You're not stupid," she said firmly. "You're a smart boy who hasn't had enough chances to learn. There's a difference. I'm 2 years behind everyone in my class. They all know stuff I've never even heard of. Then we'll help you catch up. Grandpa and I and your teachers and your tutor. You don't have to do this alone." Tommy looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "What if I can't? What if I'm just not smart enough?" Jessica reached over and picked up the social studies textbook that had been the source of his frustration. "When your mom was your age, she struggled with school too. Not because she wasn't smart, but because she had trouble concentrating and sitting still. We got her extra help, and by high school, she was on the honor roll." "Really? Really? And you know what? Even if you never make the honor roll, even if school is always hard for you, it doesn't change how much we love you or how proud we are of the young man you're becoming." That night, after both children were finally asleep, Jessica and I sat in our kitchen with cups of tea that had gone cold while we talked through the evening's crisis. "He's carrying so much anger," Jessica said. "Did you hear what he said about his mother telling him he'd never amount to anything? What kind of parent says that to their child?" "A parent who's lost in their own pain," I replied. Samantha was drowning, and she was pulling everyone down with her. I keep thinking about all the signs we missed, all the times we should have intervened, should have fought harder for those children. It was a conversation we'd had many times since Tommy and Sarah had come to live with us, this endless examination of our failures as grandparents, our inability to protect our grandchildren from their parents' dysfunction. "We can't change the past," I said. "All we can do is try to help them heal from it." 2 months into our new life as a family, we had our first real success. Sarah, who had been withdrawn and fearful since the day she'd moved in with us, came home from school with a drawing she'd made in art class. It was a picture of our house with all 4 of us standing in the front yard smiling and holding hands. "This is our family," she announced proudly, displaying the artwork on our refrigerator. "Miss Peterson said it was the best family picture in the whole class." It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. For the first time since their parents' death, Sarah was claiming us as her family, acknowledging that this house was her home, that these relationships were real and permanent. Tommy's breakthrough came a few weeks later in a conversation with his counselor that he shared with us afterward. Dr. Mitchell says I don't have to be angry at mom and dad for dying. He told us over dinner one evening. He says I can be sad they're gone and angry about how they acted when they were alive, and both feelings can be true at the same time. It was exactly the kind of emotional complexity that his counselor had been working toward. The understanding that grief isn't simple, that you can love someone and be hurt by them simultaneously, that healing doesn't require forgiveness, but it does require honesty. What do you think about that? Jessica asked. I think he's right. I miss Mom, but I'm also mad at her for leaving us at that truck stop. And I'm sad that Dad died, but I'm angry that he was always yelling and making Mom cry. Tommy paused, considering his words carefully. Is it okay to feel all those things? It's not just okay, I said. It's necessary. Your feelings are yours and they're all valid even when they seem to contradict each other. As winter approached, we settled into routines that felt increasingly natural. Homework help at the kitchen table family. Movie nights on Fridays, Saturday morning, pancakes that had become a tradition Sarah refused to let us skip. The children were thriving in school. Tommy had caught up in most subjects and Sarah had tested into the gifted program for math. But the real measure of our success wasn't academic. It was the way Sarah ran to Jessica when she had a nightmare, trusting that comfort would be provided without question. It was Tommy asking my advice about dealing with bullies at school, confident that I would take his concerns seriously and help him find solutions. It was the evening in November when both children, without prompting, started planning what they wanted for Christmas. Not wistfully, as children might, who didn't expect their wishes to be fulfilled, but with the confidence of kids who knew they were loved and would be cared for. The legal finalization came in December, just before Christmas. Judge Harrison, the same judge who had signed the restraining order that was never served, presided over the adoption proceedings that made Tommy and Sarah legally our children as well as our grandchildren. This is an unusual case, he said, looking over his glasses at the four of us seated at the plaintiff's table in his courtroom. Grandparents adopting their grandchildren after the death of both parents. But from everything I've read in the social workers' reports, this placement has been successful beyond anyone's expectations. Ms. Rodriguez had submitted a glowing report about the children's progress, their adjustment to our home, and our capability as their caregivers. Both children had requested to speak to the judge privately about their wishes, and both had been clear about wanting to stay with us permanently. Tommy, Sarah, Judge Harrison addressed the children directly. Do you understand that this adoption means Mr. and Mrs. Carr will legally be your parents now? That they'll make decisions about your schooling, your medical care, your future? Yes, sir, Tommy said. They already do that stuff. Now it's just official. And you're both comfortable with this arrangement? Yes, Sarah said firmly. Grandma and Grandpa take good care of us. They love us, and they keep us safe. Keep us safe. The words carried so much weight, so much history, so much understanding of what safety meant to children who had lived through their parents' violence and abandonment. As we left the courthouse that afternoon, legally and permanently a family, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. A year ago, we'd been grandparents living in fear of our own daughter, jumping at every phone call and wondering when the next crisis would explode our lives. Now we were parents again, responsible for two young lives that had been salvaged from the wreckage of their birth parents' mutual destruction. It wasn't the retirement Jessica and I had planned, and it wasn't the childhood Tommy and Sarah deserved, but it was real, and it was ours, and it was built on love instead of fear. That night, as we celebrated with pizza and ice cream cake, Sarah made an announcement that surprised all of us. I want to change my last name, she said. I don't want to be a Morrison anymore. I want to be a Carr like you and Grandpa. Tommy looked up from his cake, considering this. Me too, he said. I want people to know we're really your kids now. So 3 months later, we were back in Judge Harrison's courtroom for another proceeding. A simple name change that erased the last legal connection between Tommy and Sarah and the man who had tried to kill their grandparents, who had ultimately killed their mother. Tommy Carr and Sarah Carr. Our children carrying our name, carrying our hopes for their futures into whatever came next. The trust fund we'd established would ensure they had money for college, for graduate school, if they chose, for whatever dreams they developed as they grew into the people they were meant to be. But more importantly, they had something their parents had never been able to give them: stability, consistency, and the kind of unconditional love that doesn't come with conditions or threats. Some evenings, sitting in our living room while the children did homework or watched television, I would catch Jessica's eye and see my own amazement reflected there. We'd survived. More than survived. We'd found a way to build something beautiful from something that had almost destroyed us all. The house on Maple Avenue was no longer the site of violence and terror. It was home to a family that had been forged in the worst possible circumstances, but had somehow emerged stronger and more loving than any of us had imagined possible. And late at night, when both children were sleeping peacefully in their rooms, and Jessica was curled up beside me in the bed we'd shared for over 40 years, I would allow myself to believe that we'd finally won. Not the war that Samantha and Peter had started, that had ended in death and destruction with no real victors, but the deeper battle for the souls of two children who deserved better than the hand they'd been dealt, who needed adults willing to love them despite the complexity and pain of their histories. In saving Tommy and Sarah, we'd somehow saved ourselves. And in building a new family from the ashes of the old one, we'd proved that love really could triumph over hatred, that healing really was possible, that redemption could emerge from even the darkest circumstances. The war was over. The family we'd fought to protect was different than the one we'd started with, smaller in some ways, but stronger in others. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, that was enough. The peace we'd fought so hard to build began to show its first cracks on a Tuesday morning in March, almost a year after Tommy and Sarah had come to live with us. I was making coffee when the phone rang, and something about the early hour, barely 7 o'clock, sent a familiar chill down my spine. Too many crisis calls had come at ungodly hours for me to ever be completely comfortable with unexpected phone calls. Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her bathrobe, her expression mirroring the concern I felt. We'd both learned to read the signs of potential trouble, to recognize when the careful stability we'd constructed might be under threat. "Mr. Carr." The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, professional, with the careful tone that people use when they're about to deliver news that will change your life. "This is Detective Susan Walsh with the Metro Police Department. I'm calling about your daughter, Samantha Morrison." The name hit me like a physical blow. We'd worked so hard to move beyond Samantha's legacy of violence and chaos, to build a life for Tommy and Sarah that wasn't overshadowed by their parents' destructive choices. But apparently even death couldn't completely free us from the consequences of what she'd done. "What about her?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "We've been investigating a series of fraud cases involving forged documents and identity theft, and your daughter's name has come up. It appears she and her husband were involved in a much larger criminal operation than we initially realized." I sank into one of the kitchen chairs, my legs suddenly unable to support me. Jessica moved closer, her hand finding my shoulder in a gesture of support that had become second nature during our months of crisis. "What kind of operation?" "Credit card fraud primarily, but also check forgery, insurance scams, and what looks like a sophisticated scheme to steal identities from elderly victims. We've traced transactions back over 2 years, and we're looking at potential losses in the hundreds of thousands of dollars." The scope of what Detective Walsh was describing was staggering. I'd known that Samantha and Peter had money problems, that they'd been making poor financial decisions and falling deeper into debt. But this wasn't just poor judgment. This was organized crime. "Detective, my daughter is dead. She died almost a year ago." "Why are you calling me now?" "Because some of the fraudulent accounts are still active. Someone has been continuing to use the identities and credit lines that your daughter established, and we have reason to believe that person might try to contact you or your grandchildren." The implications of what she was saying began to sink in. Samantha might be dead, but the criminal network she'd been part of was still operating. And now, because we were her family, because we'd inherited custody of her children, we might be targets for whatever associates she'd left behind. "What do you need from us?" I asked. "We need to interview you and your wife about your daughter's activities in the months before her death. We also need to make sure you're aware that you might be approached by people claiming to represent debt collectors or legal processes. Anyone asking for information about accounts or assets should be reported to us immediately." After Detective Walsh hung up, Jessica and I sat in our kitchen while the coffee grew cold and tried to process this new violation of the peace we'd worked so hard to achieve. It wasn't enough that Samantha had terrorized us with snakes and death threats, that she'd nearly gotten me killed, that she'd abandoned her children in a truck stop bathroom. Now, even from the grave, her choices were continuing to threaten our family's safety. "We can't tell the children," Jessica said finally. "Tommy and Sarah have been doing so well. They're finally feeling secure, finally believing that their lives are stable. We can't destroy that with news that their mother was a criminal." I agreed, but I also knew that secrets had a way of revealing themselves at the worst possible times. If Samantha's criminal associates did try to contact us, if there were legal proceedings or media attention, Tommy and Sarah would find out eventually. The question was whether we told them on our terms or let them discover the truth in some more devastating way. The first approach came just 3 days later in the form of a well-dressed woman who appeared at our front door claiming to represent a debt collection agency. She had official-looking paperwork and a story about outstanding obligations that Samantha had personally guaranteed before her death. "Mrs. Morrison owed our client $47,000 when she died," the woman explained, standing on our front porch with the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from years of intimidating people into paying debts they might not actually owe. "As her next of kin and the guardians of her children, you're responsible for settling these obligations." I'd been expecting something like this since Detective Walsh's call, but the reality of facing it was still unsettling. This woman, who introduced herself as Linda Vasquez from Recovery Solutions LLC, looked legitimate enough, but something about her manner set off every alarm bell that months of dealing with Samantha's chaos had trained me to recognize. "I'm going to need to see identification," I said, not inviting her inside. "And I'll need to verify this debt independently before we discuss any payments." Linda's pleasant demeanor slipped slightly. "Mr. Carr, this is a legitimate debt. Your daughter signed these documents, and now that she's deceased, the obligation transfers to her estate and her children's guardians." "Then you won't mind if I have my attorney review everything before we proceed?" "Your attorney?" Linda's voice took on a sharper edge. "Mr. Carr, we're trying to work with you here. These debts can be settled for a fraction of what's owed, but only if we can reach an agreement today." The pressure tactics were textbook debt collection, intimidation, create urgency, imply legal consequences, make the target feel like cooperation was their only option. But I'd learned enough about manipulative behavior from my daughter's final months to recognize it when I saw it. "I think you should leave," I said, beginning to close the door. Linda stepped forward, preventing me from shutting her out. "Mr. Carr, you don't understand. Your daughter was involved in some very serious financial irregularities. If this debt isn't resolved, there could be criminal charges filed against her estate that could affect your custody of the children." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Pay up or risk losing Tommy and Sarah. It was exactly the kind of emotional blackmail that Samantha had used against us for years, and recognizing the pattern made me angry rather than afraid. "Get off my property," I said firmly. "If you have legitimate claims against my daughter's estate, you can work through the probate court and my attorney. Any further contact should go through legal channels." I closed the door and immediately called Detective Walsh to report the incident. She wasn't surprised. Apparently, Linda Vasquez and Recovery Solutions LLC were already under investigation for running fake debt collection scams targeting the families of deceased people. "They've been using information from your daughter's criminal activities to identify potential targets," Detective Walsh explained. "People who've lost family members who might be vulnerable to intimidation or willing to pay debts they don't actually owe just to make problems go away." "Are there going to be more of them?" "Probably. Your daughter kept detailed records, and those records included information about family members' assets, vulnerabilities. Anyone who was part of her criminal network would have access to that information." That evening, Jessica and I had a long conversation about how much of this new development to share with Tommy and Sarah. They were both doing so well. Tommy had made the honor roll last semester, and Sarah had been selected for a regional art competition. The last thing we wanted was to undermine their sense of security with news that their mother's criminal activities were still creating problems for our family. But we also couldn't pretend that nothing was happening. If there were going to be more unexpected visitors, more phone calls, more reminders of the chaos that had defined their parents' final months, the children needed to understand what was going on. We tell them the truth, Jessica decided. Age appropriately, but honestly. They deserve to know why strangers might be asking questions about their mother, and they need to understand that none of this is their fault. The conversation with Tommy and Sarah was one of the most difficult we'd had since they'd come to live with us. We waited until after dinner when they were both relaxed and focused, and then sat them down in the living room for what we'd learned to call a family meeting, our code for discussions about serious topics that affected all of us. "We need to tell you something about your mom," I began carefully. "Something that might be confusing or upsetting, but that you need to know." Both children immediately tensed. They'd learned to associate serious conversations about their parents with revelations that made their already complicated grief even more difficult to process. "Is she not really dead?" Sarah asked in a small voice. "Because sometimes I dream that she comes back, but she's different, like she's scary." "No, sweetheart. Your mom is definitely dead, but we've learned that before she died, she was involved in some activities that weren't legal, things that were against the law." Tommy straightened in his chair, his 12-year-old mind immediately grasping the implications. Like stealing, yes, and lying to banks and credit card companies to get money that didn't belong to her. "Was that why you and her were fighting?" Tommy's question was direct and perceptive in a way that reminded me how much older than his years this whole experience had made him. "Was that why she was mad at you?" It would have been easy to say yes to let him believe that our conflict with Samantha had been about her criminal activities rather than her increasingly violent demands for money. But that would have been a lie, and we'd promised both children that we would always tell them the truth about their family, even when it was complicated. "No," Jessica said gently. "We didn't know about the illegal things she was doing. We were fighting because she wanted us to give her money for things we couldn't afford and because she was making choices that we thought were harmful to your family. But now people might come here asking about the stealing." Sarah's question showed she was following the conversation despite its complexity. "Yes. And if that happens, if anyone comes to the door or calls asking questions about your mom or about money, you need to tell Grandpa or me right away. You don't need to talk to those people, and you don't need to worry about anything they might say." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing this new information about his mother. "Was Dad part of the stealing too?" "We think so, yes." "So they were both criminals." The word hung in the air between us. Criminals. It was accurate but harsh, reducing the complicated people who had been his parents to a single damning label. "They were people who made very bad choices," I said. "Choices that hurt other people and ultimately hurt themselves. But they were also your parents, and they loved you even when they weren't making good decisions about other things." "How can someone love you and steal money at the same time?" Sarah asked. It was the kind of question that went straight to the heart of human complexity, the way people could be simultaneously loving and destructive, protective and harmful. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that morality isn't simple? That people can be genuinely caring parents while also being criminals who victimize strangers? "People are complicated," Jessica said finally. "Sometimes they do bad things because they're scared or desperate, or because they've gotten involved with other people who make bad choices seem normal. That doesn't make the bad things okay, but it doesn't mean they can't also love their children." Over the following weeks, the intrusions into our peaceful life continued. Phone calls from fake lawyers claiming to represent creditors. Mail addressed to Samantha at our house, even though she'd never lived here and had been dead for over a year. A man who claimed to be investigating insurance fraud, who wanted to ask questions about our family's financial situation. Each incident was a reminder that Samantha's criminal activities had created a network of connections and obligations that extended far beyond her death. Every person she'd defrauded, every false identity she'd created, every illegal transaction she'd participated in had left traces that could still reach out and touch our family. The worst came in May when Detective Walsh called to tell us that federal investigators wanted to interview Tommy and Sarah about their parents' activities during the months before their deaths. "They're not suspects," she was quick to clarify, "but the children might have observed things or overheard conversations that could help with the broader investigation into the fraud network." The idea of subjecting Tommy and Sarah to questioning about their dead parents' criminal activities was heartbreaking. They'd already been through so much trauma, had worked so hard to build new lives that weren't defined by their parents' failures. Now they were being asked to revisit those memories in service of a criminal investigation. Do they have a choice? I asked. Legally, yes. They're minors, and you're their guardians. But the information they might provide could help recover money for victims of the fraud scheme. Some of these people lost their life savings. The moral complexity was staggering. On one hand, our primary responsibility was to protect Tommy and Sarah from any additional trauma or exploitation. On the other hand, if they had information that could help other victims, elderly people like us who had been targeted by criminals like Samantha and Peter, didn't we have an obligation to cooperate? We'll need to discuss it with their therapists, Jessica said when I told her about Detective Walsh's request. And with the children themselves. They're old enough to have a voice in this decision. Dr. Mitchell, Tommy's counselor, was cautiously supportive of the idea. Tommy has been dealing with a lot of guilt about his parents' choices, he explained during a session that Jessica and I attended. Participating in something that helps other victims might actually be therapeutic for him. It could help him feel like he's contributing to justice rather than just carrying the burden of his parents' crimes. Dr. Wang, Sarah's therapist, was more concerned. Sarah is younger and hasn't processed her trauma as completely as Tommy. Revisiting those final months with her parents, especially in a formal interview setting, could be re-traumatizing. In the end, we let both children make their own choices. Tommy, with the serious demeanor of a boy who'd been forced to grow up too fast, decided he wanted to help with the investigation if he could. Maybe Mom and Dad hurt people I don't know about, he said. If I can help those people get their money back, I want to do that. Sarah, after long conversations with Dr. Wang and with us, decided she wasn't ready to talk to investigators. I don't remember much about that time, she said, and what I do remember makes me sad. I don't want to think about it anymore. Tommy's interview with the federal investigators took place at Dr. Mitchell's office with both Jessica and me present, along with a victim's advocate and a child psychologist. The agents were gentle and professional, but the questions they asked forced Tommy to revisit some of the most chaotic and frightening periods of his young life. Do you remember your parents talking about people they owed money to? Agent Rodriguez asked, or about being worried that someone might come looking for them? Tommy nodded slowly. Mom was always scared about the phone ringing, and Dad would get really mad when she answered it sometimes. He'd yell at her for talking to people. Do you remember any names? Any specific people they mentioned? There was someone called Ray who Dad was really afraid of, and Mom used to cry after she talked to someone called Michelle. She said Michelle was going to get her in trouble if she didn't pay back money she borrowed. The agents took careful notes, asking follow-up questions that revealed a picture of Samantha and Peter living in constant fear during their final months. They weren't just criminals, they were also victims of other criminals, people higher up in the fraud network who controlled them through intimidation and threats of violence. Your parents were in deep water, Agent Rodriguez explained to Tommy afterward. They started out making bad choices, but then they got trapped by people who were much more dangerous than they were. It was a more complex picture than any of us had understood before. Samantha and Peter hadn't just been greedy or irresponsible. They'd been caught in a criminal web that ultimately cost them their lives. Peter hadn't killed Samantha in a fit of rage over their failed revenge plot against us. He'd killed her because he knew that the people they owed money to were closing in and death seemed preferable to whatever those people might do to them. Does that change anything? Jessica asked me after the interview as we drove home through neighborhoods that looked peaceful and normal, despite everything we'd learned about the violence and corruption that could hide behind suburban facades. It makes me sad for them, I said. But it doesn't excuse what they did to us or what they put the children through. People make choices even when they're scared, even when they're trapped. They chose to terrorize us instead of asking for help. They chose to abandon their children instead of protecting them. That summer, as the federal investigation expanded and more details emerged about the scope of Samantha and Peter's criminal activities, Tommy and Sarah continued to heal and grow in ways that amazed me daily. Tommy joined the middle school baseball team and discovered he had a natural talent for pitching. Sarah's artwork was selected for display at a regional gallery, and she beamed with pride when we attended the opening reception. They were becoming themselves. Not just the traumatized children of criminal parents, but individuals with their own interests and talents and dreams for the future. The trust fund we'd established would ensure they had educational opportunities their parents never could have provided, but more importantly, they had stability and love and the knowledge that the adults in their lives could be trusted to protect them. The criminal investigation concluded in September with a series of indictments against 23 people involved in the fraud network. Samantha and Peter were listed among the co-conspirators, but since they were already dead, their names appeared mostly as footnotes in a larger story of organized financial crime. Detective Walsh called to let us know that the investigation was closed as far as our family was concerned. The people who are trying to collect fake debts from you have been arrested, she said, and we've recovered records that should prevent anyone else from targeting you in the future. Is it really over? I asked. As over as these things ever are. Your daughter and her husband are dead, their criminal associates are in prison, and there's no evidence of any ongoing threat to you or your family. That evening, Jessica and I sat on our back porch watching Tommy and Sarah play catch in the yard, where I'd nearly been killed just over a year earlier. The garden had recovered completely. The flowers that had been trampled during my attack with Peter had grown back fuller and more beautiful than before. Sometimes trauma can be survived, can even lead to stronger growth given enough time and care. Do you think they'll be okay? Jessica asked, gesturing toward the children. Really okay, I mean. Not just surviving their childhood, but thriving as adults. I watched Tommy patiently teaching Sarah how to throw a curveball, his natural athleticism balanced by genuine kindness toward his younger sister. I watched Sarah concentrating fiercely on getting the mechanics right, determined to master this new skill with the same intensity she brought to her artwork. I think they're going to be extraordinary, I said. They've survived things that would have destroyed most adults, and they're still capable of joy and trust and love. Whatever challenges they face in life, they'll face them with strength that was earned through the worst kind of adversity. As autumn arrived and brought with it the second anniversary of that terrible Father's Day, when everything began, I found myself reflecting on how completely our lives had been transformed. 2 years ago, we'd been retired grandparents living quiet lives and enabling our daughter's increasingly destructive behavior. Now we were active parents again, raising 2 children who had been forged in trauma, but who were growing into remarkable young people. The house on Maple Avenue had been reclaimed from the violence that had nearly destroyed us. The backyard where Peter Morrison had tried to kill me was now home to a swing set and a treehouse that Tommy had helped me build. The living room where we'd once cowered while animal control removed a poisonous snake was now filled with homework and art projects and the comfortable chaos of family life. On the anniversary of that first attack, we held a small ceremony in our garden, not to commemorate the violence, but to acknowledge how far we'd all traveled from that dark day. Tommy read a poem he'd written about resilience and new beginnings. Sarah presented us with a painting she'd made showing our family, all 4 of us, standing in front of our house under a bright blue sky. This is who we are now, she announced with the confidence of a 10-year-old who had learned that families could be rebuilt, that love could triumph over hatred, that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the worst circumstances. Margaret Summers had been right when she'd told us that inheritance disputes could get ugly. But she hadn't told us that they could also lead to redemption, that fighting to protect an inheritance could ultimately create something far more valuable than money. The trust fund we'd established for Tommy and Sarah would ensure their educational futures, but the real inheritance we were giving them was the knowledge that they were loved unconditionally, that they had adults in their lives who would fight for them, protect them, and help them heal from whatever wounds life might inflict. Late at night, when both children were sleeping peacefully in their rooms, and Jessica was curled up beside me reading one of the mystery novels she loved, I would sometimes lie awake marveling at the miracle of our survival. Not just physical survival, though, that too had been uncertain during those terrible months of stalking and threats and violence. But spiritual survival, the preservation of our capacity to love and trust and hope, despite everything we'd been through. The ability to open our hearts to 2 damaged children and help them heal while we healed ourselves. The strength to build something beautiful from the wreckage of relationships that had once meant everything to us. Samantha was gone, and with her went any chance of understanding why she'd chosen hatred over love, destruction over healing. But Tommy and Sarah remained carrying her DNA and her smile, and her stubborn streak, but free to make different choices than their parents had made. They would grow up knowing that families could be complicated, that people could be simultaneously loving and destructive, that sometimes the adults who were supposed to protect you failed in ways that changed everything. But they would also know that healing was possible, that love could triumph over hatred, that redemption could emerge from even the darkest circumstances. The snake that had arrived in that cardboard box on Father's Day morning had been intended as a symbol of everything their mother thought we were: cold-blooded, dangerous, unwelcome in normal people's homes. But in the end, the real serpent had been the hatred that consumed Samantha and Peter, the poison that destroyed them both and nearly destroyed us. We had survived that poison and created something clean and healthy and good from the ruins it left behind. Two children who had been abandoned in a truck stop bathroom were now honor students and artists and athletes with bright futures ahead of them. Two grandparents who had lived in fear for their lives were now parents again, raising the next generation with wisdom earned through the hardest possible experience. The war that had begun with a hissing box on our coffee table was finally truly over. And sitting in my garden on a quiet autumn evening, watching my wife help our children with homework, while dinner simmered on the stove, I understood that we hadn't just won. We had transformed victory into something far more precious. The peace that comes from knowing that love really can conquer hate, that families really can heal from the worst kinds of damage, and that sometimes the most beautiful futures grow from the darkest pasts. For the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence in our house was comfortable rather than ominous. The phones rang with calls from friends and teachers and normal life instead of threats and demands. The mail brought school newsletters and birthday party invitations instead of fake debt collection notices. We were free. Free from fear. Free from the chaos that had defined too much of our lives. Free to be the family we'd always wanted to be, but had never quite managed to become, until tragedy forced us to discover what we were really capable of. The storm had passed, and in its wake, we had found not just survival, but peace.